Frost lay white across the mountain before the sun had a chance to wake. Deep in the pines, a strand of wire lay severed in the dirt. The cut clean, straight, not made by any animal. 3 sets of boot prints passed through. Expensive. Oiled with the same care a man gives a rifle. On the porch of the log cabin, a woman stood still, her hand tight around a tin cup of coffee gone cold. She did not tremble. Her breath did not quicken. She only looked toward the trees, where, the night before, someone had stood a long time outside a window and had left behind a map with a single red circle drawn on it. In her coat pocket, a 5-year-old letter smoldered like an ember beneath ash. Beneath the floorboards, a revolver had slept for 5 long years. This morning both were about to wake. The wind shifted. The old horse in the corral pricked his ears, and somewhere in the pines, 3 men were waiting. The mountain woke before she did. Ellen Cade stood on the porch of her cabin with the tin cup of black coffee going cold in her hand. Steams swirled from the surface, vanished into the pre-dawn air, the kind of cold that made a person's bones remember every mistake they ever made. She was 38 years old. She felt older. The high country did that, aged a person the way Frost aged a fence post, slow, patient, inevitable. Her hair was still dark, but there was gray at the temples now, silver threading through what used to be all night. Her hands were rough, cracked at the knuckles, a woman's hands but with a man's work behind them. Nell. That was what everyone called her these days. Ellen was the name on the deed, Ellen Cade. A quiet woman who kept to herself. Bought 2,000 acres up in the Black Pines 6 months back. Paid cash, didn't answer questions, didn't need to. But Nell was who she was in her own head, and there was another name too. One she hadn't used in 5 years. One she'd tried to bury the way a man buries a rifle. He's promised himself he'll never fire again. Ellen Kincaid the ghost. She sipped the coffee, bitter as juniper bark, just how she liked it. The eastern sky was starting to color up now, rose and iron, the peaks catching light before the valleys did. She watched a hawk circle over the ridge, watched it wheel and drop. Watched something die out there, in the sagebrush without a sound. That was the mountain. That was every morning. Behind her, through the log wall of the cabin, she could hear her daughter breathing. Ruby was 7. Ruby was asleep. Ruby had a stuffed bear named Judge, who was missing an ear and half his stuffing, and who Ruby had decided last winter was going to be the sheriff of her imaginary zone. Ruby was the only reason any of this mattered. Nell set the coffee down on the porch rail, turned toward the tree line. Something was wrong. She couldn't have said. What? Not at first, but there's a language the mountain speaks, and if you listen long enough, you start to hear it. The birds were quiet in the wrong direction. The wind was coming down off the ridge, but it was carrying a smell that didn't belong. Sweat, leather oils, something from metallic silk. She stepped off the porch. Frost cracked under her boots. Reb snorts had sit in the corral. The old horse had his ears forward, watching the tree line too. He knew. Nell walked the perimeter. She'd strung the bell wires 3 weeks ago. Gut line stretched thin between saplings at knee height. Small brass bells tied at intervals. Not to keep anything out, just to know. The first wire was fine, the second was fine, the third was cut. She knelt, ran her thumb along the severed end, not snapped, not chewed, cut with the bullet. The kind of cut you learned in a place where mistakes got a man killed. Straight edge, precise, no jagged fibers. Someone had knelt right where she was kneeling now, held the wire between 2 gloved fingers, drawn a knife across it and stepped through the gap. Her heart didn't race. Her hands didn't shake. Because that wasn't how it worked anymore. She'd left that woman behind. The one who reacted. The one who bled adrenaline every time the world tilted sideways. Nell Cade was steadier than that. Had to be. She had a daughter asleep in the cabin and a horse in the corral, and no husband to ride in and tank the weight off her shoulders. So, instead of racing, she just breathed, in through the nose, out through the teeth, and started to read the ground. 3 sets of tracks, 3 men. She could tell by the boot sizes, by the stride lengths, by the way the weight settled in the print. One man was heavy, 200 and change. Another was lean and quick. The third was medium build, but walked like he'd been trained to walk. Heel to toe, rolling silent when he needed to be. The boots were expensive. She could see it in the tread, not the cracked flat soles of a drifter. not the round hobnails of a working ranch hand. These were tooled, custom, Nike boots that cost more than most men in this valley made in a season, and the leather smelled like oil, not old sweat and horse oil. Someone had cared for these boots the way a man cares for a rifle, which meant these men cared for their rifles too. She followed the tracks 20 yards, found the second cut wire, then the third. Whoever had come through here had known about her alarm system, had known where to look, had walked her land like it was a map they'd already studied, like they'd been here before. That was the part she didn't like, because she'd been the one to string the wires. She'd done it alone, in the dark. Nobody knew where they were except her. Except somebody did. Nell straightened. The sun broke over the ridge and cut the frost into small, burning diamonds. Beautiful. Every morning up here was beautiful. That was the trick of the mountain. It killed you with beauty. It smiled at you while it froze your fingers to the bone. She went back to the cabin. Ruby was still asleep. Nell stood in the doorway of the little loft and watched her daughter's chest rise and fall. The child had one arm around Judge the Bear. Her hair was tangled from sleep. There was a smudged charcoal on her cheek from drawing last night. Nell had told her to wash her face before bed. Ruby had promised she would. Ruby had lied. Ruby was 7, and lying to your mother about washing your face was practically a job description. Nell smiled, just for a second. The smile went away. She went to the wooden trunk at the foot of the bed, lifted the lid. Underneath the blankets and the winter wool was a false bottom she'd built herself. She pried it up with the tip of her knife. Inside there was a lockbox. Inside the lockbox there was a badge. United States Marshal. The metal was tarnished. She hadn't touched it in 5 years. Hadn't wanted to. Hadn't needed to. Next to the badge there was a revolver. Colt .45. Well-oiled, wrapped in a strip of oiled cloth. 6 rounds already in the cylinder. She hadn't fired it in 5 years either. She didn't take the badge. She didn't take the Colt. Not yet. She just looked at them because looking at them was already a kind of surrender. Already an admission that the woman who buried them under the floorboards might have to come back out. And Nell Cade had promised herself, sworn it. That woman was dead. Ellen Kincaid was dead. The ghost was dead. And she had a 7-year-old daughter who was going to grow up thinking her mother was just a mother. Just a mother, that was all. Nell closed the lid, went back downstairs, made another pot of coffee. By the time Ruby came stumbling down the ladder in her nightdress with her hair a bird's nest and Judge the Bear tucked under her arm, Nell had bacon in the pan and biscuits in the Dutch oven, and her voice was perfectly steady. "Morning, little Marshal. Morning, Mama." Ruby yawned, wiped her nose on her sleeve, climbed up on the bench at the table. "I dreamed about the elk again." "Which elk?" "The big one with the crooked antler." Nell nodded. She turned a strip of bacon in the pan. "He's a good one to dream about. He said hello to me." Did he now, in elk language? And what does elk language sound like? Ruby thought about it, screwed up her face, made a sound somewhere between a burp and a whistle. Nell laughed. It surprised her that she could still laugh, that the mountain hadn't taken that from her yet. "That's exactly what an elk sounds like," she said. "You've got a gift." Ruby beamed. She ate her breakfast, 2 biscuits, 3 strips of bacon, a tin cup of goat's milk. She swung her feet under the table because her legs weren't long enough to reach the floor yet. She talked about the elk, and about Judge the Bear, and about a drawing she was making of a raccoon she had never seen but was pretty sure lived under the porch. Nell listened. Nell watched her, and underneath the listening, underneath the watching, part of her mind was already working. Cold, steady, Marshal cold. 3 men, expensive boots, cut wires, they'd been here. They knew the land. They knew her alarm system, which meant one of 2 things. Either they'd scouted her property before she moved in, or they'd been watching her since. Neither answer was good. "Mama." Nell blinked. "Sorry, honey." "What?" Ruby was looking at her strangely, the way a child looks at a parent when the parent has drifted somewhere the child can't follow. "You went away," Ruby said. Nell smiled, reached across the table, tucked a strand of Ruby's tangled hair behind her ear. "I'm right here, little Marshal. I'm right here. You didn't hear what I said." "Tell me again." Ruby sighed, the way 7-year-olds sigh. Like the burden of explaining the world to slow adults was almost more than she could bear. I said, "Can I go check on the horses today after your chores? I already did my chores. Yesterday's chores." "Yes, that doesn't count." "But Mama, little Marshal." Ruby made a face, but she made it the way a child makes a face when she knows she's lost the argument and just wants to protest the ruling for the record. Nell nodded. "Fine." Ruby slid off the bench, grabbed Judge the Bear by his one remaining ear, started up the ladder to the loft. Halfway up, she stopped, turned around. "Mama." "Yes, baby. Somebody was outside last night." Nell went still. The kind of still that isn't a choice. The kind of still that just happens to a body when a body has been trained to be still for a living. "What do you mean?"
"Honey."
Ruby shrugged. "I heard walking."
"What kind of walking? The heavy kind? How many?"
"I don't know." "Where by the window?" "My window. The one that looks at the pine trees." Nell's mouth went dry. She kept her voice easy. Kept her hands relaxed on the table. "Sweetheart, did you see anybody?" "No." "Did Mo? Did anybody see you?" "I don't know, Mama. Did you tell me because you were scared?" Ruby thought about it. "No. I told you because I thought you would want to know." Nell nodded slow. "Thank you, little Marshal. That's exactly right. You always tell me about anything strange. Even if it's small, even if it's silly. You tell me all right. I love you. I love you, too, Mama." Ruby climbed the rest of the ladder. Nell sat at the table. She didn't move for a long time. She didn't cry. She didn't scream, because tears were a luxury she couldn't afford yet. Instead, she set her coffee down very carefully, stood up, went to the trunk, opened it, and this time she took the Colt. She loaded it in sissons. Rounds she'd been carrying in a leather pouch for 5 years without ever loading. The cylinder clicked when it turned. 6 rounds, 6 chances to kill 6 men. She hoped it would be enough. She knew already that it wouldn't be. She strapped the belt around her hip, the weight of it settled against her thigh, like coming home to a house she'd sworn she'd never live in again. She saddled Rebel. The old horse felt the tension in her hands and shifted his weight and looked at her sideways. He knew this woman. He'd carried her a long time ago. He remembered. "Yeah," Nell said to him. "Yeah. Boy, I know." She rode east. The tracks had gone east, a little deeper into her land, toward the valley where the elk came to water. She'd chosen to leave wild, the place she'd told nobody about. Except somebody had known. Somebody had known everything. She kept the Colt loose in the holster. She kept the Sharps rifle across her back. 45-70 caliber, a cannon of a gun. She'd used it to bring down bears and men, and once in New Mexico, a horse thief at 300 yards who had cursed her name as he fell, and then apologized as he died. She hadn't forgotten his face. She never forgot any of them. That was the price of being the ghost. The tracks were easier to follow now that the sun was up. She rode slow, read the ground. Every 20 yards, she stopped Rebel and studied the trail. The 3 men had walked with confidence, long strides, even weight, not sneaking, not hurrying. They'd walked the way you walk somewhere you own. That was the part that ate at her. She followed them past the first cut wire, past the second, past a granite outcrop she used as a landmark. The corridor between the rocks opened up, and below her spread the valley. The place she'd bought this land for. The place she'd chosen because it was going to be a sanctuary. Because the elk came here to drink. Because the bears passed through in the fall. Because a mountain lion had once looked her in the eye from 10 feet. And it moved. And neither of them had been afraid, and Nell had understood in that moment that this was a place worth protecting. She stopped Rebel at the edge of the drop. Looked down. There was blood on the rocks. Not much. Enough. Drops on the pale stone, scattered in a pattern that told her a story she didn't want to hear. Something had been wounded here. Something had struggled. Something had staggered off into the brush, leaving a trail she could follow if she had the stomach for it. She dismounted, left Rebel tied to a scrub oak, climbed down, touched a blood drop with her gloved finger. Still tacky. 12 hours, maybe less. She followed the trail. 40. Then it disappeared into a thicket of dogwood, so thick a bear couldn't have pushed through it without leaving sign. And there was no sign, which meant whatever had been wounded here had been carried out. Not walked, carried. She stood up, scanned the valley, found the blind almost immediately. Because she was looking for it now. because she knew what to look for. It was well made, she'd give him that. Deadfall and camouflage netting, arranged with the patience of men who understood concealment, positioned to command a perfect view of the watering hole. The kind of blind you built when you meant to come back, when you meant to stay a while. She approached with the sharps in her hands. The blind was empty, but it wasn't abandoned. There were shell casing on the ground brass. She picked one up, rolled it between her fingers. Read the stamp Winchester, 253 grain, belted magnum, $12 a round, $12. A working man in this country made $1 a day if he was lucky. $12 was a week's wages. And these men had left the casings on the ground like they didn't matter, like they had more where those came from, like every shot they had been paid for by somebody else, somebody with money, somebody allowed. She pocketed 3 of the casings, turned to leave, and then she saw it, half tucked under a folded canvas tarp in the corner of the blind, a piece of paper, folded twice, weathered but not old. She pulled it out with 2 fingers, unfolded it. Her hand went cold. It was a map, hand-drawn careful lines, every ridge and stream marked, her cabin marked, her wood pile marked, and her daughter's window, circled, not just marked, circled, in red ink, with a small notation next to it in a cramped, precise handwriting, 4 words. Child sleeps here. Confirmed. Nell stopped breathing. Not by choice, her lungs just stopped. For maybe 5 seconds she didn't take in air. She stood in that blind with the map in her hand and the smell of gun oil in her nose, and she felt the whole world tip sideways underneath her. Somebody had stood outside Ruby's window at night. Somebody had confirmed her daughter's sleeping locations. Somebody had drawn a map with red ink circles. She'd been in that cabin. She'd been asleep. She'd been 30 feet away from Ruby's window. And somebody had stood in the pines and looked in and drawn a red circle around her 7-year-old. Nell's teeth clenched so hard she felt a molar grind. She folded the map slowly, put it in her coat pocket. Then she walked out of the blind, because if she stayed in there another minute, she was going to burn it to the ground. And she couldn't burn it. She needed it. Every scrap of what these men had left behind was evidence, was a thread, was a name she could pull on until the whole tapestry came apart. She climbed back to Rebel, mounted up, rode. She rode a mile before she let the tears come, and they came for maybe 30 seconds. That was all she allowed, because a marshal who cried while she worked was a marshal who missed things. Ellen Kincaid had learned that at 22 years old in a rainstorm in the Oklahoma Panhandle. 3 Ravensons the old Kiowa scout had told her, cry after, not during ease. For seeing so, she cried for 30 seconds. She wiped her face diseased. She turned Rebel toward Silver Ridge. The town was 12 miles away. She could be there by noon. She had questions to ask. She had people to look in the eye. She had a mountain to save and a daughter to protect, and a promise to keep that she hadn't even known she'd made until this morning. When the tracks appeared, when the map appeared, when a stranger had stood outside her daughter's window in the pines and drawn a red circle around Ruby's small, warm, sleeping body. She rode one down out of the high country. The mountain watched her go, and somewhere in the pines, 3 men watched her too. Town of Lie's Silver Ridge sat in a wide bowl of a valley 12 miles from the Black Pine. Population maybe 300 souls, mostly ranchers and miners and the widows and children who'd inherited the land when the men had died young. Whoa. The way men died young in this country. A church at one end of Main Street, a saloon at the other, a general store in between. A jail nobody had used in a decade. She rode in a little after one, tied Rebel to the hitching post outside the land office. People noticed her. They always did. The Cade woman, the quiet one from the mountain, the one who paid cash and didn't answer questions. Some of the older men touched their hats when she passed. Some of the women pretended not to see her. She'd been in town 6 times since she'd bought the land. She hadn't tried to make friends, hadn't tried to make enemies either. She just wanted to disappear. Disappearing was proving harder than she'd hoped. She went into the land office first school. The clerk was a thin man named Harrison. 50, balding, wore spectacles that were always sliding down his nose. He looked up from his ledger when she came in, and his face did a small thing, a flicker, just for a second. Then he was polite. Mr. Harrison again, or Mrs. Cade. Mr. Harrison, something I can help you with. I need to look at some records. Which records? The properties around mine. He hesitated. That was the thing, he hesitated. A land clerk in a small town gets asked about neighboring properties all the time. There's no reason to hesitate, unless there is any particular reason. I'm curious about my neighbor. He looked at her over the rim of his spectacles. Then he pulled the books. She spent 20 minutes with them, silent, reading, her finger tracking down columns of names and dates and ss. She wasn't a woman who made notes. She had a memory for this kind of thing, always had. Ellen Kincaid could read a page of criminal crowd records once and quote them back to you a year later. 3. Ravens had told her once that her memory was going to save her life someday. It had, more than once. 3 of the 4 properties surrounding hers had changed hands in the last 18 months. All 3 had been sold to the same buyer, Denver Pacific Land and Cattle Company. Nell had never heard of them. She looked up. This company, they local. Harrison shook his head. Denver-based, bought through a law firm, quiet sales. 3 properties in 18 months. Yes, doesn't strike you as unusual. Land changes hands, Mrs. Cade. She looked at him, long enough that he looked away. Anything else you want to tell me, Mr. Harrison? No, ma'am. Nothing at all. Nothing at all. She thanked him. Left the office. Stood on the wooden sidewalk in the noon sun. Because he was lying. Because everybody in this town was going to lie to her. Because that was how it worked when a town had been bought. She walked down toward the sheriff's office. Deputy Tom Wheeler was Silver Ridge's only law. 50-something. Soft in the middle. Wore a badge that looked heavier than it should on a man who wasn't ready to carry it. She'd never spoken to him. He'd never spoken to her. They'd nodded at each other twice in 6 months. And that was the sum total of their acquaintance. She saw him before he saw her. He was standing stacked outside the saloon talking to a freight driver, laughing, big easy laugh, the kind of laugh a man laughs when he doesn't want anybody to think anything is wrong. He turned, saw her, the laugh died on his face. For a full second he stood there and stared at her like she was a ghost, because maybe she was. Maybe he'd heard the whispers, maybe somebody had told him, maybe the mountain talked and the mountain had said her old name. Then he did something strange. He turned and walked into the saloon. Didn't touch his hat, didn't nod, didn't acknowledge her at all. Just turned on his heel and walked through the swinging doors and disappeared. Nell watched him go, filed that away. Deputy who walked away from a citizen he'd never had a problem with was a deputy who was afraid. Afraid of her or afraid of what her being here meant. Either way, interesting. She walked to the church next. The white paint on the walls was peeling in the November light. A small bell hung that leaned about 2 degrees to the west. Father Elias Cooper had been the priest here for 20 years. He was tending late vegetables in the garden beside the church when she came up the path. A man in his 60s, weathered, kind eyes, hands that had done real work all his life. He looked up when she approached, smiled. The smile was warm. The eyes were not Mrs. Cade. Father, this is a pleasant surprise, is it? He straightened, set down his hoe. What can I do for you? She looked at him a long moment. Then she said, Bill Hollister. His face didn't change, but his hands stilled. That was all she needed. Been dead 6 months, Mrs. Cade. I know. Why are you asking? I bought his land. I know that too. Then you know why I'm asking. He was quiet. He looked at the church, then at the mountains beyond it, then at her. Bill Hollister was a complicated man, he said finally. Good at heart, I think, but weak. He made choices he regretted. What choices? The kind we confess on our deathbeds. Did he confess to you? You know I can't answer that. Can't or won't. He met her eyes, both. She nodded slow. Father, if you know something that might help me understand what's happening on my land, I need you to tell me. I know what I heard in confession, Mrs. Cade, and that stays between a man and his God, even if children get hurt. He flinched, just a small flinch, but she saw it. Bill Hollister tried to make things right before he died, Father Elias said. He left a letter, a written confession of sorts. He asked me to give it to somebody who might need it, somebody who might be able to finish what he couldn't. Where is it in my keeping? Give it to me. Come back tomorrow, Mrs. Cade. Let me pray on this tonight. If the Lord guides me to give it to you, I will. It wasn't what she wanted. but it was more than she'd walked in with. She nodded. It's tomorrow, then, Mrs. Cade. Yes, he hesitated. Some secrets are kept by the living, some by the dead. Both kinds haunt us. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she sees, sleep well, Father, and she walked away. She found Adeline Whitfield at the boarding house. The young woman was sitting in the common room with a leather journal open on the table in front of her. Ink on her fingers, charcoal on her sleeve, a pair of small round spectacles pushed up on her forehead. 29 years old, dark hair pinned up in the loose way of a woman who had better things to do than fuss with hairpins. She was a naturalist from back east, studying elk migration. Nell had met her twice, liked her both times. Adeline looked up. First brightened. Mrs. Cade, I was hoping I'd see you today. You've been on my land, Miss Whitfield. I have, without asking. The younger woman colored. I meant to. I should have. I apologize. What have you seen up there? Adeline hesitated. She glanced around the common room. It was empty except for the two of them, and the old woman who ran the boarding house and who was in the kitchen at the moment, banging pots around loudly enough that nothing said in the front room was going to reach her. Still, Adeline lowered her voice. Sit down, Mrs. Cade, please. Nell sat. Adeline turned the journal toward her, turned a page. The sketches were good, very good. The kind of good that came from a person who had learned to draw not because it was pretty, but because it was useful. 3 men in a clearing. Their faces were angled away, not quite clear, but their bodies were exact, the way they stood, the way they held their rifles, the gear on their belts. 5 days ago, Adeline said, before dawn, I was trying to catch the elk at first light. I heard voices and I hid. Nell studied the drawings, Silas Drummond. She didn't know his name yet, but she knew the type ex-military. The way he carried the rifle, the way his shoulders squared, that was a man who had killed for a living and gone home peacefully afterward. She turned the page. More sketches, the processing frame, the blinds, the wagons. Adeline had documented all of it. You're braver than you look, Miss Whitfield. I don't feel brave. That's what brave feels like. Nell turned another page and froze, because in the corner of this sketch, the last one, almost an afterthought, a small figure standing on the ridge above the 3 armed men, watching them, not with them, not part of them, just watching. A man in a long coat with his shoulders held in a way that was so familiar. Nell felt her chest close up like a fist around her heart. She knew that stance. She knew it. She had shared a bed with that stance for 8 years. Daniel, her husband. The man who had left her 5 years ago with a folded note on the kitchen table that had said only, I cannot stay, I love you, but I cannot stay. Forgive me if you can. The man she had grieved, the man she had cursed. She had told her daughter about only in the past. Tense was on the mountain. He was on her mountain. He was watching Cyrus Vane's men from a distance. And Adeline Whitfield had drawn him in the corner of a sketch without knowing she was drawing the resurrection of Nell Cade's whole life. Nell didn't move. She didn't breathe. Adeline noticed Mrs. Cade. Are you all right? Nell couldn't speak. Her tongue wouldn't work, Mrs. Cade. She forced herself to breathe, forced her fingers to unclench from the edge of the journal, forced her face to be still. Who is this, she said. Her voice was a stranger's. This man. In the corner, Adeline leaned in, frowned. I don't know, I didn't see him clearly. He was up on the ridge. I could only just make him out. He wasn't with the others. He seemed to be, well, watching them. The way I was watching them. You didn't tell anyone. I didn't think it was important. He was so far away. I don't think so, but. Adeline hesitated, but when I looked up again later, he was gone, and I hadn't heard him leave. He moved. He moved like a man who didn't want to be seen. Nell stared at the drawing, at the small figure in the corner, her husband alive on her mountain. For 5 years, she'd told herself he was probably dead. She'd told Ruby he was, in a soft, careful way. Daddy went away, honey. Daddy loved you very much. Daddy is somewhere he can't come home from. She'd hated herself for the lie, but she'd told it because the truth, that he'd left, that he'd walked out, that he'd chosen to go, that truth would have broken Ruby. But now, if he was alive, if he was watching, if he had been up here on this mountain and had never come home, never sent a letter, never even sent a wire, then what was he and what had happened, and why? She closed the journal, slid it back to Adeline Whitfield. Listen to me. Yes, you need to leave the boarding house tonight. Pack your things and come out to my cabin. Mrs. Cade, Miss Whitfield, I have work to do here. Your work is going to get you killed. Adeline stared at her. Those men on the mountain. They aren't hunters. They're not poachers. They're something worse. And they have money, and they have connections, and they don't care who they hurt. And you drew their faces, and that puts you in a grave, Miss Whitfield. Unless we move you tonight. Adeline swallowed. I understand. Do you? I do. Good. Nell stood. Adeline caught her sleeve. Mrs. Cade, yes. That man on the ridge, the one in the corner. Do you know him? Nell looked down at the younger woman's hand on her sleeve. Then she looked at her face. She could have lied. She was good at lying. She'd been lying to Ruby for 5 years about her father. But she was tired, and Adeline had drawn him, and Adeline had trusted her. Yes, Nell said. I know him. Who is he? Nell breathed out. The word came from a place inside her she'd buried 5 years ago. He's my husband. Adeline's eyes widened. But you're yes, everyone said. I know, Mrs. Cade. Get your things, Miss Whitfield. I'll be at the wagon in 20 minutes. Bring your journal. Bring every sketch you have. If you leave any of it behind, those men will find it. She walked out of the boarding house without looking back, the beer and the bird. She rode home with Adeline's wagon behind her. The younger woman had thrown her things together in a canvas satchel and locked her room and paid the landlady for the week and asked no more questions. Adeline Whitfield was going to be quite trouble in a good way. Nell could see it already. 29 and pretty and educated and possessed of the kind of quiet iron that only shows up in a person when the world tries to break them. They didn't speak on the ride. There was too much to say. The sun was low when they reached the cabin. Ruby ran out to meet them. She stopped short. When she saw the wagon, she looked at Nell. Nell said, Ruby, this is Miss Whitfield. She's going to stay with us for a few nights. Ruby considered this. She was 7. Everything was worth considering. Do you like drawing? She said finally. Adeline smiled. I do. I draw too. I'd love to see your drawings. Ruby nodded solemnly. You can see them after supper. I would be honored. That settled it. In Ruby's court, if you were honored to look at her drawings, you were family. Nell unsaddled Rebel, rubbed him down, let him into the corral. Adeline unloaded her satchel and her journals and a small carved wooden case that Ned later found out on St. Kincaid, the finest cells east of St. Louis. They ate supper together, beans and cornbread. Nell brewed strong coffee. Ruby regaled Adeline with the entire history of Judge the Bear, including the incident where he had allegedly been sheriff of a town called Bearville and had had to arrest a squirrel for theft. Adeline laughed. Nell watched them. And underneath the laughing and the watching, that other part of her mind kept working. Alive, on the mountain. Why had he not come home? Why had he not written? Why had he been watching Cyrus Vane's men from a ridge like a man who had a plan? The answer she kept coming back to was one she didn't want to look at directly, because if he was watching them, he must have known them. And if he had known them for years without telling her, then he had chosen not to come home. And Nell Cade did not know if that was a betrayal or something worse. After supper, Ruby brought out her drawings. She had a whole stack. Elk, rebels, Judge the Bear. A raccoon she had never seen. A pig she had once seen at market and had not liked. The mountain, the cabin. Her mother, drawn with a very serious mouth and very large boots and something in her hand that Ruby explained solemnly was a big mama gun. Nell laughed. Then Ruby said, and this is my new one. She handed Adeline a drawing. Adeline looked at it. Her face changed. Saw her face change. Nell reached across the table. Let me see, honey. Ruby handed it to her. It was a carved wooden bird, a songbird of some kind, small. Rendered with careful strokes of charcoal, a little bird with a fan tail and an eye like a black bead. It sat on a wooden peg base, and it was clearly not something Ruby had made herself. Ruby had drawn it, but somebody else had carved it. Ruby. Yes, Mama. Where did you get this? Ruby looked up, unconcerned, innocent. The man in the woods gave it to me. The room went very still. Adeline was watching Nell's face. Nell was watching Ruby's. Which man in the woods, sweetheart? The one who visits sometimes, when you're not looking. Nell felt her breath go out of her. Ruby, baby, how many times has this man come to see you? Ruby thought about it, ticked off the count on her fingers. 1 time, 2 times, 3 times, 4 times. 4 times, Mama. 4. He's nice. Is he? He's very quiet. He said not to tell you because you would worry, but I decided to tell you anyway. Because you said, yes. You said always tell you. Yes, baby. So I'm telling you. Nell held the drawing in her hand and looked at the carved bird her 7-year-old daughter had drawn from memory. A bird carved by a man who had been coming to see Ruby 4 times without her mother's knowledge. She could barely make her voice work. Ruby. Yes, what did the man look like? He was tall. He had a long coat. He had a beard, a dark beard with gray in it. Ruby. Yes, Mama. Did the man say his name? Ruby nodded, solemn, serious, 7 years old and about to break her mother's whole world open with one word. He said his name was Daniel. The wind stopped outside. Or maybe Nell just stopped hearing it. Because inside her head there was only that one word. Daniel, her husband, her missing husband, her not dead husband. Her husband who had been coming to see their daughter for months, apparently. Talking to her, bringing her presents, carving her birds, and telling her not to tell her mother. Adeline was very quiet. Ruby was watching Nell's face. The child said, Mama. Nell couldn't speak. Mama, why are you crying? Nell wiped her face. She hadn't known she was crying. I'm not crying, little Marshal. I'm just tired. It's been a long day. Was the man a bad man? No, sweetheart. Was he a good man? Nell looked at her daughter. She said, I don't know, baby. I don't know what he is. $50,000. Sent Ruby aloft an hour later. Adeline offered to sleep on the floor, and Nell laid out a bedroll for her by the fire. Neither woman spoke of what Ruby had said. Not yet. There was too much of it. It was going to have to come out slow, like a splinter that had been in a wound for 5 years. Nell went out on the porch. The night was cold. The stars were out, and there were so many of them. The sky looked like a woman spilled sugar across black velvet. She stood there. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just stood there. Daniel, her husband, alive. Alive on her mountain, coming to see their daughter without coming to see her. She heard hoofbeats, distant, then closer. She reached back and drew the Sharp's rifle from where she'd leaned it against the porch rail. 5 riders came up the trail out of the darkness. She recognized the man in front even before his face was clear. Tall, fine coat. Sitting his horse like the world was a table he'd served on a platter. Cyrus Vane. She'd never met him, but she'd heard the name in Adeline's whispered recap of what Bill Hollister's confession letter apparently said. And a man who came riding up to a woman's cabin at night with 4 armed men behind him did not need an introduction. They stopped 20 yards out. Vane raised a gloved hand. Mrs. Cade. She said nothing. Mrs. Cade, I don't come armed. My men are merely an escort. I'd like to talk. Yes, from 20 yards. He's supposed. She could see it in the porch lamplight. From here, if you prefer. She didn't lower the rifle, but she didn't raise it either. She held it across her body, the way a woman holds a rifle when she is not committing to a decision yet. Who are you? My name is Cyrus Vane. I know your name. Then you know why I'm here. I don't. I'd like to buy your land, Mrs. Cade. It isn't for sale. I'll offer you $50,000. The wind moved in the pines, $50,000 abowers. More money than the 2,000 acres was worth by a factor of 4. More money than Nell would earn in a lifetime of hard, honest labor. More money than would have made her a rich woman if she took it. She could buy a house in a coastal town somewhere flat and warm. She could send Ruby to a proper school. She could be done with mountains and blood and marshal work and everything she had ever tried to leave behind. $50,000, she smiled. Just a little, Mr. Vane. Yes, you should have stopped at 10. His head tilted. I don't follow, Mrs. Cade. When a man offers me 5 times what a thing is worth, he's not paying for the thing. He's paying for the silence. His smile stiffened. I have no idea what you mean. I think you do, Mrs. Cade. No, I beg your pardon. The answer is no. He was quiet a moment. Then he said, You're being unreasonable, am I? There's a great deal of money at stake. There are people involved who don't accept unreasonable answers. Then they can come tell me themselves. Silence. The 4 men behind Vane shifted in their saddles. Vane looked at the cabin. He looked at the porch. He looked at the window of the loft. A small figure had appeared. Ruby. Standing at the window in her nightdress, looking out at the strange men in the dark. Vane looked at Ruby. He looked back at Nell. His eyes did something ugly, something that had not been there a second before. He didn't smile. He didn't sneer. He just looked at her and let her see the animal that lived behind his manners. "Little Ruby," he said. Nell's hand tightened on the sharps. "Careful, Mr. Vane. She likes Silver Ridge Elementary, doesn't she? I hear the teacher there is quite fond of her, Mr. Vane." They walked that path from the schoolhouse to the boarding house twice a week for the reading circle. Every Tuesday, every Thursday. 2:45 in the afternoon. Nell raised the rifle. She didn't aim it at him. Not quite. Not yet. She just raised it, just enough. Vane held up both hands, smiling again now. "I mean, offense, Mrs. Cade. I merely mention because a mother should always know what is happening around her child." She said, "Get off my land, of course, now." 60,000, he said. 60,000 and I'll never trouble you again. Get. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he tipped his hat. "Good evening, Mrs. Cade." "Good evening, Mr. Vane." They turned their horses. They rode down the trail into the dark. Nell on the store the sharps in her asuhias until she couldn't hear the hoofbeats anymore. She stood there until her arms started to shake from holding the rifle up. She stood there until the wind picked up out of the north and she could smell the first snow coming. Then she lowered the rifle. She turned. Ruby was in the doorway now, barefoot in her nightdress. Judge the bear tucked under her arm. "Mama." "Yes, baby." "Was that a bad man?" Nell went to her, knelt down, held her daughter's small face between her hands. "Yes, little Marshal, that was a bad man. Are you going to have to fight him?" Nell looked at her daughter, at the seriousness in Ruby's small dark eyes, at the 7-year-old face that had just recognized a bad man in the dark without needing to be told. "Yes, honey," she said. "I think I am." Ruby thought about this. She nodded. "Then you should fight him hard, Mama." "I will, baby. Because I don't like him." "Neither do I, little Marshal." She carried Ruby back up to the loft, tucked her in, kissed her hair, sat with her until she was asleep. Then she came back down. Adeline was sitting up on her bedroll by the fire, wide awake, her hair loose around her shoulders and her face pale. "Mrs. Cade, Nell." "What?" "My name is Nell." Adeline nodded. "Adeline. Listen to me, yes. Tomorrow morning I'm taking Ruby down to the boarding house of Mrs. Hensley in the north end of town. She's an old friend. She'll keep Ruby safe. Then I'm coming back here and I'm going to war. With Vane. You can't fight him alone. I've done it alone before." Adeline studied her. "Who were you?" she said before. Nell looked into the fire. The snapped at a knot in the pine log, sent a small orange spark up the chimney. "There was a name," Nell said, "a long time ago, in another life." "What name?" "Ellen Kincaid." Adeline's breath caught, because even naturalists from back east had heard the stories. Even scientists who spent their time drawing elk had heard the wisps of the woman who had tracked outlaws across 3 territories and brought them in dead or alive, and mostly dead. And who they did. Sure, you didn't hear her coming. You just heard the shot. "You," Adeline whispered. "Me." "But you." "I quit 5 years ago after a boy died. A 16-year-old boy in an alley in Santa Fe. I couldn't do it anymore. So I quit, and I met a man, and I married him, and we had a baby, and he left, or I thought he left. And I came up here to disappear, and now they've come to my mountain, and they've drawn a red circle around my daughter's window. And they've made themselves know my child, and they've offered me $60,000 to walk away." She looked at Adeline. Her eyes were dry. Her voice was quiet. "The ghost isn't quite dead yet, Miss Whitfield. It turns out she was only sleeping." Adeline nodded once, slow. "What do you need me to do?" Nell smiled, small, tired, but real. "Sleep, Adeline. Sleep tonight, because tomorrow is going to be a long, long day." The fire snapped. The wind pressed against the windows. Somewhere up in the loft, a 7-year-old girl slept with a one-eared bear tucked under her arm, and did not yet know that her mother was going to have to become somebody else to keep her safe. And out in the pines, somewhere on the mountain, in the dark, a man in a long coat, with a dark beard at the temples, stood among the trees and watched the cabin, and did not come inside. Not yet, not tonight, but soon, very soon. Judd the beer rides out. The snow came in the night, not much, just a dusting. Just enough to lay a thin white sheet across the mountain and remind the world that winter was not asking permission this year. Nell was already awake when it started. She hadn't slept. Not really. She had lain on her back on the narrow bed downstairs, listening to Ruby breathe in the loft and Adeline breathe by the fire. And she had watched the ceiling and let her mind do what it had been trained to do a long time ago. Prioritize. Because there was too much to feel and no time to feel it. So she did what the ghost had always done. She put the feelings in a box. She set the box on a high shelf, and she promised the woman she used to be that she would come back for that box later, if there was a later. Ruby came down the ladder just past 6. Nell had coffee going, biscuits in the pan. She had already saddled Rebel in the dark, already hitched up the wagon, already loaded a canvas bag with Ruby's clothes and Judge the Bear and a small tin of the child's favorite honey drops that Nell had been saving for Christmas. Christmas was not going to happen in this cabin. Not this year. She turned when she heard Ruby on the ladder. Oh, smiled the way a mother smiles when she is trying to hide the fact that the ground has fallen out from under her feet. Morning, little Marshal. Morning, Mama. Ruby rubbed her eyes. Why are you dressed like that? Like what, honey? Like the written pictures, because Nell was wearing her old coat, her old boots, her old wide-brimmed hat that she hadn't put on her head in 5 years. She looked in the small mirror over the wash basin, and she barely recognized the woman looking back. Older, harder, but still there underneath. We're taking a trip today, sweetheart. We're down to Silver Ridge to stay with Mrs. Hensley for a little while. Ruby stopped. Ruby was 7. Ruby was not a fool. Why? Because Mama has to work. What kind of work? Grown-up work. That's not a real answer, Mama. Nell, down in front of her, took Ruby's small, cold hands between hers. You're right, little Marshal. It isn't, so I'll give you a real one. There are some bad men who want to hurt this mountain, and they might want to hurt us too, and I need to make them stop. And while I do that, I need you to be somewhere safe. Somewhere they can't find you. Ruby was quiet. Her eyes were dark, steady, not scared, not yet. Mrs. Hensley is safe. Mrs. Hensley is safe. Is Whitfield coming? No, baby. Miss Whitfield is going to help Mama. Are you going to fight the bad man from last night? Yes. With the big Mama gun, if I have to. Ruby nodded, slow. Then she looked up. Mama, yes. Will you come back? Nell felt the box on the high shelf tremble. She did not let it fall. I will come back, little Marshal. I will come back for you. I promise. Promise. Ruby put her small arms around her mother's neck, held on for a long moment. Then she pulled back and picked up Judge the Bear and said very seriously, Judge is going to keep watch. That's good, honey. He's a real good sheriff. I know he is. They left the cabin at 7. Adeline stayed behind to gather up all the sketches, every drawing, every note, everything that could be used as evidence. She would keep the papers safe. She would keep the fire burning. She would be there when Nell came back. Nell drove the wagon down the trail with Ruby beside her on the bench. The snow was thin under the wheels. The sun was cutting through the pines in long gold bars. Rebel plodded along tied to the back of the wagon. The world was beautiful in the way. The world was always beautiful before something terrible happened. Nell had learned that a long time ago, too. Beauty was not a promise. Beauty was often just the light before the shot. She got Ruby to Mrs. Hensley's house by 9. Mrs. Hensley was 70 years old, widow of a copper miner, grandmother of 9. She had a rifle over the door and a shotgun by the bed, and she looked Nell in the eye when Nell said trouble, and she said only how much. Nell said, the kind that pays men to hurt little girls. Mrs. Hensley nodded once. That was the whole conversation. She led Ruby inside and set out a plate of cookies and a small stack of picture books and told Ruby they were going to have a fine time, and if any strangers came to the door, Ruby was to hide in the potato cellar and not come out until Mrs. Hensley called her by her middle name. Ruby's middle name was Grace. Only 3 people in the world knew that, now 4. Nell hired 2 men to sit outside Mrs. Hensley's house. Both were old friends. Both had been in her Marshal days. Both owed her favors from a decade back. She gave them each $50 and a description of what they were watching for. Silas Drummond, any strangers, any wagons that lingered, they understood. They took up positions on the porch and in the barn across the street. Nell kissed Ruby on the forehead. Be good for Mrs. Hensley. I will. I love you. I love you too, Mama. She turned to go. Ruby said, Mama, back. Ruby, he'll Judge the Bear. Take him, honey. He's yours. You need him more. Nell couldn't speak for a moment. She took the bear, the one-eared bear with the missing stuffing and the button eyes. She tucked him inside her coat. Thank you, little Marshal. You're welcome, Mama. She walked out of Mrs. Hensley's house and did not look back because she could not afford to look back. And she rode Rebel through the streets of Silver Ridge to the church. The letter in the cellar. Father Elias was waiting. He was standing in the doorway of the small stone chapel with his hands folded in front of him, and his face was the face of a man who had not slept. He nodded to her. Mrs. Cade, Father, come inside. She went inside. The chapel was cold. The windows were dim in the November light. He led her past the altar to a small door behind the pulpit. He down a short flight of stone steps into a cellar that smelled of candle wax and old paper. There was a wooden chest against the far wall. He knelt to open it, took out a sealed envelope, yellowed old, and a second thing, a leather-bound ledger, thick, battered, wrapped in oilcloth. He looked at her a long moment. Mrs. Cade, yes, before I give you these, I need to tell you something. Tell me. Bill Hollister wrote this 3 days before he died. I know. He didn't just write about the hunting, I know. He wrote about your husband. She went still. The whole cellar went still. He extended the envelope toward her. She took it. Her hands did not shake. Read it here, Father Elias said, please. She sat down on the wooden bench along the wall. She opened the letter Bill Hollister had written in a shaky old man's hand. But the words were clear. The words were careful. The words had the terrible precision of a man who knew he was going to die soon and who did not want a single sentence to be misread. He wrote about Cyrus Vane. He wrote about the money. $5,000 a year to look the other way. Then 10, then 20. He wrote about the photographs of his daughter in Denver that Vane's men had shown him, what they would do to her if he did not cooperate. He wrote about how he had said yes for 8 years. How he had let them build the processing station, how he had let them slaughter animals on his land the way slaughterhouses slaughtered cattle, how he had cashed the checks and drunk the whiskey and slept every night in a bed that felt like a coffin. He wrote about the names, Deputy Wheeler, $200 a month, Wesley Doyle, Deputy U.S. Marshal out of Denver, $2,000 every 6 months. And then he wrote about Daniel. Nell had to stop reading. She had to close her eyes. She had to remind herself that she was still breathing, and that her heart was still beating, and that she had a daughter in a widow's kitchen down the street who needed her mother to be. She opened her eyes, stirs. She kept reading. Bill Hollister wrote that 5 years ago, Nell Cade had come to him, had confronted him, had asked him what he knew about the hunting operation. Bill had lied. Bill had said he knew nothing. But Bill had also, that same night, sent word to Cyrus Vane. Because Vane had told him to. Because Vane had paid him to. Because Bill Hollister was too weak and too old and too tired to do the right thing, when doing the right thing might have cost him his daughter's life. Vane had taken Daniel, not killed him, taken him. Bill wrote that Daniel had been alive as of 6 months ago, that he had heard it from Vane's own mouth, that Vane had bragged about it, that Daniel had been held somewhere in Denver. Vane's private prison for a man who had refused to give up whatever it was he was refusing to give up. Bill wrote that he did not know exactly what Daniel had refused to give up, but he suspected. He wrote about a letter, a false letter. Vane had a man who could copy any handwriting, a forger, a skilled one. And Vane had made this forger write a letter in Daniel's hand and had it delivered to a young woman in the mountains named Ellen Cade. Bill did not know what the letter had said, but he could guess. It would have said Daniel had left willingly, that he loved her, but could not stay, that she should forgive him if she could. Nell's whole body went cold, because she had that letter, still folded up in a small tin box in the trunk under her bed. She had read it 1,000 times over 5 years. She had believed it. She had grieved it. She had built her whole new life around the story that letter had told her. Her husband had not left her. Her husband had been taken from her, and she had spent 5 years hating a ghost, and she had told her daughter a lie without knowing it was a lie. Nell sat on the wooden bench in the cellar of a small stone church in Colorado, and she did not cry, because if she started crying, she was not going to stop, and she could not afford to stop. She turned the page. Bill wrote about the last piece. Nell Cade had escaped 6 months ago, somehow. Bill did not know how. Vane had been furious, had torn Colorado apart looking for him, had put men on every road between Denver and the Black Pine, had convinced himself that Daniel was going to come out of the mountains with everything he knew and hand it to a federal marshal. But Daniel had not come out, not to Denver, not to Silver Ridge, not to the federal office. He had gone up into the mountains, into the Black Pine, onto the land his wife had bought because he had known. Somehow he had known that she was there, and he was watching her, and he was watching them, and he was carving small wooden birds for the daughter he had not held in 5 years and giving them to her in the woods, and telling her not to tell her mother. Because if her mother knew, her mother would come looking for him, and if her mother came looking for him, Vane would find him first. Nell folded the letter very slowly, very carefully. She put it back inside the envelope. She sat still for maybe 30 seconds. Then she looked up. Father Elias was watching her. His eyes were full of tears. She said, "Father, yes, your name is in this letter." His face collapsed. "I know. There is a line in Bill Hollister's ledger that says, Father Elias Cooper, $200 a month for 6 years. He shut his eyes. Yes. She stood up. She was very calm. She was the calmest she had been in 5 years. She said, "Look at me." He looked at her, tears rolling down his weather-dry face. She said, "Tell me why." He opened his mouth. He closed it. He opened it again. He said, "Because I heard Bill's confession, and I heard others too, and Cyrus Vane knew I heard, and he offered me money not to keep it, not to sell it, just to accept it, to let it sit in my hand, so that if I ever went to the authorities, I would be a priest who had taken money from a criminal. I would be no witness at all. So you took it. I took it. And what did you do with it?" He looked up. Every cent, every singles. Sent to the orphanage in Denver, to the poor fund of the mission at Estes Park, to the widow of the miner who died in the flood at Leadville. I did not spend $1 of Cyrus Vane's money on myself. I have the receipts. I have the letters of thanks. I have the ledger of the ledgers. She stared at him. "Show me." He reached into the chest, pulled out a second, thin book. Handed it to her. She opened it line after line. Dates, sums, recipients. Every donation matched to a payment from Vane. Every dollar traced to a use that was not his. She closed the book. She said, "Father, yes, you are still a coward, I know. You should have gone to the marshals. You should have gone to Denver. You should have gone anywhere and said everything, even if you lost your church and your calling and your life. I know Ruby was born the year you started taking that money. My daughter has been alive as long as you have been afraid, I know. But," he looked up, "but," she said, "you kept the letter. You kept Bill's letter. You kept the ledger. You waited for somebody to come, and you gave it to me." So she put the envelope inside her coat, beside Judge the Bear. 2 witnesses to 5 years of grief. So, she said, "You are going to walk into a federal courtroom in Denver, and you are going to sit in the witness chair, and you are going to say every word of this out loud under oath, in front of God and every man on the jury." He nodded, weeping. "Yes. And whatever happens to you after that, you accept." "Yes. Say it, Father. I accept." "Good." She turned to go. He said, "Mrs. Cade." She stopped at the door. "Yes. Your husband is alive, I know. He has been on your mountain for 6 months. I know. He loves you." She did not turn around. She said, "I don't know that yet." And then she climbed the stone steps out of the cellar. The man on the floor, she left the ledger with him, told him to keep it safe until Marshal Owen Blackwood arrived. She kept the letter, because the letter was hers. Bill Hollister had written it to her, to Ellen Cade, to Ellen Kincaid, to whichever woman she needed to be next. She rode back to the Grand Hotel. The clerk in the lobby saw her coming, and his face did a small trick with itself, because there was another man in Silver Ridge she had not spoken to yet, a man Bill Hollister's letter had named, a man whose name had punched her in the ribs, Wesley Doyle, Deputy U.S. Marshal, Daniel's partner, Daniel's oldest friend, the best man at their wedding. She walked up the stairs to the 2nd floor. She knocked on the door of room 12, because she was going to knock. She was going to be polite. She was going to give the man one chance to open the door on his own 2 feet before she kicked it in. He opened the door. He looked at her. His face went the color of fish belly. "Ellen." "Wesley." "Ellen." "May I come in?" "Ellen." "God, Ellen." She walked past him into the room. He shut the door behind her. He turned. He couldn't look at her. He couldn't stand still. He stood with his back against the door and his hands pressed flat against the wood behind him as if the door were the only thing holding him up. She stood in the middle of the room and looked at him. He was 50 now, gray hair lines around his eyes, face pouched from too many years of whiskey. He had been handsome once. He had stood beside Daniel at the wedding in a black suit and had made a toast that made her cry with laughter. He had held Ruby the day she was born. He had put his big rough hand on Ruby's tiny head and had cried. He had said, "This is the best day of my life, Nell. This is the best day of my life." She looked at him now. She said, "Bill Hollister wrote a letter." He said nothing. "Every payment Cyrus Vane ever made you. $2,000 every 6 months. For 8 years." He said nothing. $16,000, Wesley. He's nothing. That's what Daniel was worth to you. He slid down the door. He sat on the floor. He put his hands over his face, and he wept the way a grown man weeps when he has run out of every excuse he ever made. She let him weep, because it was going to happen anyway, because there was no version of this conversation that did not begin with him on the floor. When he had breath again, she said, "Wesley, yes, look at me." He raised his face. She had never seen a man look older in 5 minutes. "Tell me what happened, Ellen. Tell me what happened to my husband." He drew a breath. It shook like a lantern in a storm. "They came to me, Vane's men, 9 years ago. I was already up to my neck. Gambling debts. A woman I shouldn't have been with. A boy, she said, was mine. He offered to make it all go away. But you said yes." I said yes, and Daniel didn't know. Dan didn't know, and when Daniel started asking questions, he shut his eyes. "I told them. You told Vane that Daniel was getting close." "Yes." "You set up a meeting on the ridge." "Yes." "You told Daniel you had evidence. You told him to come alone. You told him to meet you there." "Yes." "Wesley, Ellen, did you know they were going to kill him?" "I thought they were going to scare him, Wesley." "I swear to God, Ellen. I swear on my life, on my son's life. I thought that they were going to threaten him. I thought they were going to warn him off. I thought he would come home to you shaken and quiet and then leave it alone. But they didn't kill him. I know that now. You wrote the report that said he did. You wrote it. You told the Marshal Service he had fallen from his horse. You held me at the funeral, Wesley. You held me at his empty grave, Ellen. You held my daughter." He shattered. He put his face down on his knees on the floor of that hotel room, and he shattered into pieces the way a bottle shatters on stone. She stood over him, and she did not soften, not 1 inch, because he did not deserve softness, because Daniel had been in a cage, because Ruby had grown up without a father, because she had spent 5 years mourning a man who had been alive the whole time. She said, "Wesley." He couldn't answer. "Wesley, look at me." He looked at her. She said, "Daniel escaped 6 months ago." His head came up, his face changed. "What? He escaped?" "Ellen, he's alive, I know. How do you?" "He has been on my mountain. He has been coming to see Ruby in the woods. He has been carving her wooden bird. He has been watching Vane's men. He has been trying to find a way to bring the whole operation down before Vane finds him first." Wesley stared at her. Then something happened in his face, something she had not expected. A kind of light, a terrible kind of light. He said, Then there is a way. A way to what? A way for me do one thing right before I die." She looked him. She let him said, "Wesley, yes, I don't need one thing, I need everything. Every scrap of paper you have on Vane, every meeting, every payment, every name you have ever heard him say. I need Wheeler. I need who else in Denver is on the take. I need the location of the ranch where they held. I need to know who the state senator is that Daniel refused to deem. I need every piece of it, Ellen. Every piece. Good." Kept notes. "Good. I have a satchel under the floorboards in my house in Denver. I did not know why I was keeping it. Some of it goes back 9 years. I thought maybe, if I maybe someday." She looked down at him. She said, "Someday is today." She left him on the floor. She walked out. She left the door open behind her because she did not care who saw him crying the wire to Denver. She rode Rebel over to the telegraph office. She stood at the counter in her old coat with the wind coming through the door behind her, and she wrote out the telegram herself because there was only one man in Denver she trusted with what she was about to send, and she wanted him to know exactly who was sending it. She signed the message with the name she had not written in 5 years. She wrote it slow. She wrote it the way a woman signs a check she cannot afford to bounce on Cade. The operator looked at the name, looked up at her. He was a young man. He had not been in Silver Ridge 9 years ago. He did not know who Ellen Kincaid had been, but he knew the tone of the woman standing in front of him. He said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "Send it now." He sent it. She paid. She walked out. This was picked up from the north. She looked at the sky. More snow coming. Not tonight, tomorrow maybe. 2 days at the outside. She had time, not much, but some. She rode back through the streets of Silver Ridge, and she felt eyes on her from every window, because word was going around now. She could feel it. Somebody had told somebody had told somebody. The Cade woman. The quiet woman. She was Ellen Kincaid. The ghost. She was here, and she'd been here for 6 months, and she was awake. She wanted them to talk because she wanted it in his bed tonight and know that the import centimeters was not a walk to be bought, was not going to be moved, was going to come. She wanted him to feel that just for one night. Before the marshals came, she rode past the sheriff's office. Deputy Wheeler was standing on the porch. He watched her approach. He watched her stop, rebel at the hitching post. He watched her dismount. He watched her walk up the steps. He did not run. He did not go inside. He did not draw his weapon. "Deb, Mrs. Come," he said. "Mrs. Cade." They looked at each other. He said, "I thought you'd come sooner." She said, "Why?" Because I've been waiting." Waiting for what? Waiting for somebody with the spine. She looked at him. He looked at her. He said, "Come inside, ma'am. I've got some things I need to tell you, and this porch is not the place." She followed him inside. He shut the door. He walked over to a desk, and he opened a drawer, and he took out a small badge. Not the edge on his chest. Another one. He held it up. She looked at it. Then she looked at his face. United States Marshal. Federal. Not the local star of a small-town deputy. The real thing, he said. "My name is Thomas Wheeler. I was seconded to Silver Ridge 7 years ago on a federal detachment. My assignment was to gather evidence on the wildlife trafficking operation that had been reported to operate out of all Poachers' property. I have been operating undercover." She stared at him. He nodded. I know how it looks. I have taken money from Vane. I have looked away from murders. I have watched Bill Hollister sign checks I could have used to end this 100 times. But Federal wanted the whole ring. Every name, every judge, every senator, not just Vane, every man, and every time I got close, somebody higher up would tell me to hold to wait, to keep collecting. How high? He looked at her state senator, 2 federal judges, a member of the territorial legislature, a vice president of Denver Pacific Railroad. She sat down. She had to sit down because this was bigger than she had thought. Because Daniel had not been a poaching ring. Daniel had been fighting a machine with wheels inside wheels, a machine that had bought itself a mountain and a town and a piece of the federal government and had thought it was untouchable. Wheeler sat down across from her. He looked older than his years. He said, "I have been waiting for a break for 7 years, and then you moved onto that mountain. Why did that matter? Because I knew who you were. You did. I served with Blackwood 10 years ago. Before I was assigned here, Blackwood spoke of you often. He said if he ever had one bullet left in the world, he would put it in your gun before his own. I read your file the week I got the assignment, and I've been thinking about you every day since." She stared at him. He said, "When you moved in 6 months ago, you knew that the whole thing was going to blow, one way or the other. Because Vane wasn't going to leave you alone, and you weren't going to leave him alone. Even if you didn't know it yet, even if you thought you'd retired, I knew. Because I know who Ellen Kincaid is, and Ellen Kincaid does not retire when there are children in the crosshairs." She was quiet a long time. Then she said, "Wheeler, yes, you are going to have to answer for the years you sat still. I know. Even if the case makes, I know you'll go before an internal review. I know you may lose the badge, I know, and you did it anyway." "Yes." She looked at him. She said, "Then we are going to make sure it was worth it." He nodded. She said, "Owen Blackwood is on his way. I sent the wire an hour ago. He'll be here in 2 days." 3 at the outside. We have that window to build the case. He'll come. He'll come. Blackwood will bring a squad, will, and when he does, ma'am, we take Vane. She looked at him. She said, we take Vane, but first, we find my husband. Wheeler nodded. Yes, she stood. She said, I need you to go to dinner tonight. Get to Wesley Doyle's house before he does. He's going to hand over a satchel. I want you to be the man he hands it to. Yes. And I need you to move on the ranch. Vane's ranch. Vane has held my husband there. There are records, there are cages, there are men, there is a bookkeeper somewhere. I want the whole place torn up. I want every man in that house in irons. That's a big raid. Blackwood can do it. He can. Then we do it. Wheeler stood. He said, ma'am. She said, yes. He said, where's your husband now? She looked out the window of the sheriff's office, at the pale winter sun, at the mountain in the distance. She said, he's up there. He's up on the black pine watching. And he doesn't know that I know, and he doesn't know that Vane is about to bring the fire. We need to warn him. I know. Can you find him? She turned to Wheeler. The corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile. But something. Marshal. Yes. They didn't call me the ghost, because I couldn't find people. The fire in the rocks. She rode up the mountain in the dying light. Rebel knew the trail as well as she did now. He walked steady. He didn't need her hands on the reins. She let him carry her. She let herself think Daniel, alive, not gone, not lost, not dead, held, tortured, isolated, held while she buried an empty coffin, while she taught his daughter that Daddy had gone somewhere he could not come back from, while she strung the words together in the softest way she could find, while she came up here to disappear because she could not bear one more night in the house they had shared. She thought about the wooden bird, small, careful, a songbird with the weather yet bit. His tiny hand around it. Daniel had carved that. Daniel had carved that out in the woods, and he had given it to a 7-year-old girl, and he had asked her not to tell, because he wanted his daughter to know she had a father, because he could not bring himself to come out of the trees, because he thought if he came out, Vane would find him, and then Ruby would have no father at all. She thought about him standing on the ridge, watching the cabin, every night, maybe, every night for 6 months, watching his wife make coffee, watching his daughter play in the yard, watching them live a life he could not enter. She started to cry. She rode up the mountain in the dying orange light. Judge the bear, tucked inside her coat, and Bill Hollister's letter tucked to Judge, and she rode with tears running down her face, and she did not stop them, because there was nobody to see her. She cried for Daniel. She cried for Ruby. She cried for the 5 years she had been angry with a man who had not left her. She cried for the years he had spent in a cage, refusing to give up whatever it was. He was refusing to give up so that she and Ruby could stay alive. Then she stopped crying. Because she had reached the ridge, and she needed to think, she dismounted, tied Rebel loose to a scrub oak, walked to the edge, looked down. She knew this ridge. She had walked it 4 times since moving in. She knew every game trail, every seep of water, every wind cut in the rock. If she had been Daniel, if she come 6 months ago, with nothing but a knife and the clothes on her back and a broken body full of 5 years of survival, she would have made herself a camp, somewhere hidden, somewhere with water, somewhere where the wind carried away smoke. There were 3 places. She thought about it. 2 of them were too close to the game trails, too close to where Vane's men worked. He would not have picked those. The 3rd was above the North Spring, a hollow of rock, sheltered, plucked from view from every direction, but one. That was where she would have gone. She got back on Rebel. She rode north. She reached the spring at dusk. She left Rebel down slow. She went up the last 100 yards on foot. Slow, quiet, every step, careful. She had done this 1,000 times. Approaching a camp, approaching a suspect, approaching a man who might or might not be waiting for her with a gun, except this time. The man was her husband. She smelled the smoke before she saw the fire, just a thin thread of it, almost nothing. He had built it small, under an overhang, where the smoke would disperse against the cold rock. He knew what he was doing. She stopped at the edge of the hollow. She said quietly, not loud, just slightly into the dark, Daniel. The wind moved. Nothing else. The wind again, then a voice. From above her, from behind her, from a place she should have checked and hadn't checked, because he was better than she had remembered, because he had learned things, because years in a cage had made someone she did not quite know. Nell, her breath caught that voice, older, thinner, rougher, but that voice. She did not turn. She did not move. She said, "Daniel." He said, "Don't turn around." She didn't. He said, "How did you find me?" She said, "I taught myself to find people who didn't want to be found." He was quiet. Then he said, "Vane's men. They came to the cabin last night. I know. He offered me $60,000. I know." He mentioned Ruby's school. Said, "Then I, Daniel, why are you not with us?" His voice cracked. "Because if I come to you, they will kill you. They are going to come anyway. Not if I stay in the woods. Not if they don't know I'm alive. They know." Another silence. Then, how? Bill Hollister's letter, he suspected. He wrote it. Father Elias has it. Wesley has told me. Wheeler has told me. Everybody knows. She heard him breathing. Rough breaths. He was fighting something big. He said, "Nell." "Yes, I've been up here 6 months. I know. I've been eating what I could catch, sleeping where I could hide. I have been carving small things for Ruby out of pine wood. She's beautiful, Nell. She's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. Her chest broke. She's yours. I know. She's asked about you every day." He was silent. She turned slowly. He was standing above her on a shelf of rock, 10 feet up. A tall, thin man in a long coat, beard down his chest, gray at the temples, older than 42 years, thinner, harder, wearing a rifle across his shoulder that she recognized. It has to be honest. He had spent round with only that. His face was wet. He said, "TNT." He said, "I never left you." She said, "I know that now." He said, "The letter. I know, Vane, I know." He came down from the rock slow. He was thinner than a man should be. He walked like a man whose bones ached. He came to the edge of the small fire, and he stopped and he looked at her across the light. He said, "Nell, I don't know what to say." She said, say hello." She said this hello. She said, "Hello." They stood there. They did not touch, because they could not yet touch, because years were years, because she did not know this man yet, because he did not know her, because they were going to have to learn each other again, from the beginning if they lived. She said, "Daniel."
"Yes.
"Vane is going to send men."
Soon. Tonight, tomorrow, very soon. I know.
"I have called for a federal marshal, Owen Blackwood.
He is coming from Denver. How long? 2 days. Maybe 3. That's a long time. I know." He looked at her. "Ruby somewhere, safe."
"Yes, and Adeline Whitfield with you."
"You know Adeline?"
"I know everything that has happened on your land for 6 months, Nell." She almost smiled, almost. She said, "Daniel, yes, come home." He shook his head. "Not yet, Daniel. If I come to the cabin, Vane's men see me. They come at the cabin. That is what I've been preventing for 6 months. I've been staying out here to keep them looking outward, not inward, not at you, not at her. They already know. Not for certain. Yes, for certain. I stay out here until Blackwood comes. I keep them looking for me, not at you, Daniel." "Nell, please. Nell, listen, please. Just this once. Listen." She listened. He said, "I have spent years learning how to live with the possibility that I would never see either of you again, and then 6 months learning how to live with seeing you but not touching you. I can do this 2 more days. I can do what I cannot do is walk into that cabin and have men kick down the door while my daughter is in the loft." She looked at him. She said, "She's not in the loft." "What?" "I moved her to Mrs. Hensley's, down in town, 2 guards, good men." He blinked. He said, "Nell, yes, you are a marvel, I know." He almost laughed. Then he did, a small broken laugh, from a man who had not laughed in a very long time. She said, "Daniel, 2 days, fine, 2 days, but you're staying at the cabin with me and Adeline, not out here, not one more night out here in the cold. And if Vane's men come, they come, and we kill them all together. And when Blackwood comes, he can pick up the pieces." He was quiet. Then he said, "All right, say it, Daniel." "All right, Nell, come home. I'm coming home." She held out her hand across the fire, Kinger hand. His fingers were rough, cold, real, her husband's hand, the hand that had held her at the altar, the hand that had held Ruby the day she was born, the hand that had gripped his father's rifle across the ridges for 6 months, protecting a woman who had thought he had left her. She closed her fingers around his. She said, "Daniel, yes, you should have found a way. I know. Anyway, I know you were wrong. I know." She said, "I love you anyway." He broke, right there, by the fire. He put the rifle, and his rifle slid off his back into the dirt, and his arms went around her, the way a drowning man's arms go around a rope. He shook, and she held him. She held her husband, who had been dead and was not dead. She held him with Judge the Bear inside her coat, with pressed between them. She held him with the wind coming down out of the north. She held him a long time. Then she said, "Daniel, yes, we need to go now, before it snows." He nodded. He picked up his rifle. She led him down the slope to Rebel. They rode back to the cabin together. 2 riders, 1 old horse, a very long silence. She rode in front. He rode behind, arms loose around her waist, because he could not sit a saddle alone for very long anymore. She could feel his ribs against her back, every one of them. The cabin lights came into view through the trees at 9. Adeline was on the porch with a lantern in her hand. She saw the 2 figures on horseback come out of the dark. She saw the second one. She put a hand over her mouth. She said, "Fust, oh. Nell dismounted. "Help Daniel down," she said. "Adeline, this is my husband." Adeline said, "Mr. Cade." Daniel said, "Miss Whitfield." Then he swayed on his feet, and Nell caught him. And Adeline came off the porch running, and between the 2 of them, they got him into the cabin. They laid him on the bed by the fire. Nell took off his coat. Underneath it, he was skin and ribs, and a shirt that had been white once and was gray now. Adeline said, "Oh, Nell." Nell said, "Boil water. Get the good soup. There's a jar in the cellar. Get bread. Get the salt pork." Moved. Nell knelt by the bed. She said, "Daniel, yes, you're home, yes. Sleep." He looked at her. His eyes were very blue in the firelight. Bluer than she had remembered, or maybe she had just forgotten. Years were long enough to forget a lot of things. He said, "Nell, yes, where is Ruby's bear?" She reached into her coat. She pulled Judge out. She set the 1-eared bear on her husband's chest. She said, "He's the sheriff." Ruby said, "He'd watch." Daniel smiled. For the first time in years, he closed his eyes. He fell asleep with Judge the Bear on his chest, and his wife's hand in his hand, and the fire snapping in the hearth, and a naturalist from back east stirring soup at the stove, and outside and wind picked up out of the north, and the first real snow began to fall. Nell sat by the bed a long time. She watched him breathe. She thought about the 2 guards outside Mrs. Hensley's house. She thought about Wesley on the road to Denver. She thought about Wheeler at the telegraph office. She thought about Owen Blackwood, somewhere between here and there, on a train pushing north with a squad of federal deputies and a warrant and a very long. She thought about Cyrus Vane, somewhere down in the valley, in a warm room, with a glass of good whiskey, not knowing yet, not knowing that Bill Hollister's letter was in his enemy's coat, not knowing that Wesley Doyle had cracked, not knowing that Wheeler was federal, not knowing that Nell Cade was in a bed by the fire on the mountain he had been searched for 6 months, not knowing that Ellen Kincaid was awake, not knowing that the ghost had found her rifle, not knowing that the reckoning was 2 days away. The snow fell. The cabin was warm. Nell sat by her husband and did not sleep, and watched over the small circle of light that contained everything in the world she had ever loved, and somewhere out in the dark beyond the snow. Cyrus Vane's men were saddling their horses. Because Vane could not wait for Blackwood either, because Vane knew, because Vane had known the whole time. Because Vane had a man in Denver who read every telegram that passed through the wire between Silver Ridge and the federal marshal's office, and that man had already sent word. The reckoning was not 2 days away. The reckoning was tonight. The snow comes down. The snow was falling straight down now. No wind, no sound. Just the fat, slow flakes coming out of the black and settling on the roof of the cabin and on the corral rails and on the back of Rebel where he stood dozing in his stall. The kind of snow that meant winter was making a decision. The kind of snow that quieted the whole world into a false peace. Nell sat by the bed. Daniel slept. Adeline had gone into the loft an hour ago to rest a little. She'd tried to argue. Nell had said sleep 2 hours. Then you take the watch. I need you sharp before dawn. Adeline had nodded. Adeline had climbed the ladder. Adeline was probably lying up with her heart in her throat. Nell was not tired. The ghost did not get tired at times like these. She put more wood on the fire. She stood. She walked the cabin. She checked the shutters on the north window. She checked the bar on the door. She looked at the Sharp's rifle where she had leaned it against the mantel, and she looked at the colt, where it sat on the small table beside the bed, and she looked at Judge the bear rising and falling on her husband's chest. She stopped by the bed. She looked at Daniel. She thought about what she would tell Ruby if this went the wrong way. Then she thought about that, because that thought was a door she could not open. Because if she opened it, would not close it again. She went to the window. She wiped the glass with her sleeve. She looked out into the falling snow. For a full minute she saw nothing except there, in the tree line. Not movement, not exactly. Just a wrongness. A place where the snow was not falling straight. A place where the flakes bent around something the way water bends around a stone. And then further to the right, another and another men. At least 4 waiting. Nell stepped back from the window. Her breath caught for 1 second, then it steadied, because she had been half expecting this since the moment she rode down from the ridge with Daniel behind her. Because Vane was not a patient man, and Vane in Denver, and Vane's man in Denver would have seen her wire to Blackwood the moment she sent it, which meant Vane had known since noon, which meant Vane had ridden as soon as he knew, which Silas Drummond had left Silver Ridge 3 or 4 in the afternoon with every gun he could put in the saddle, which they were here. Now she moved. She woke Adeline first, softly, a hand on her shoulder. Adeline's eyes came open clear. Good woman. Dale said, they're outside. Adeline said, how many? 4 at least, probably 8. What do? You take the Winchester from the shelf. You go to the back window. If anything comes at the back, you fire, and you do not stop firing. You do not open the door for any reason. You do not come out. Not for Daniel. Not for anybody. Do you hear me? I hear you, good girl. She woke Daniel next. He came awake the way a man comes awake in a cage, fast, not startled, ready. His eyes found hers, and they were clear. He said now, she said now. He pushed himself up, winced, reached for the rifle beside the bed. Nell said, Daniel, yes, you are not going to fight. He looked at her. Nell, you are not going to fight. You do not have the strength to fight. You have not eaten more than I need you to do something else. He looked at her. He said, what? You are going to be the reason I have to win. He closed his eyes. He said, Nell, say yes. Nell, say yes, Daniel. Yes. Take the colt. Sit at the foot of the bed. Anybody comes through that door who isn't me, you put them down. That's all. Yes, you do not come outside. You do not follow me. If I don't come back, you stay in this cabin with Adeline until sunrise. Then you walk her down the mountain. You get to Ruby. You take my daughter. You take my daughter.
Now say it, Daniel.
I take our daughter. Yes, and I raise her right. Yes. He looked at her a long moment. Then he said, come back. She said, I intend to. She kissed his forehead. She took the Sharp's rifle off the mantel. She took the leather ammunition pouch with the Magnum rounds she had picked up at Vane's blind. 50 grain more than her Sharps liked, but it would fire. And she took her hunting knife. And she took her old badge out of the trunk under the bed. She had never told Daniel it was still there. She pinned it inside her coat now under the wool, where nobody could sit, but where she could feel it. United States Marshal Ellen Kincaid. For the last time she went to the back door. She opened it a crack. The snow was thick. 50 yards, maybe less. She could not see the tree line from here, which meant they could not see her. She slipped out. She shut the door behind her. She stood in the snow for 1 heartbeat. Then she was gone. Move and shoot. She moved along the west wall of the cabin, kept low. The snow deadened everything. Her boots made no sound. She reached the corner, waited, listened. She heard them. Not close. Not yet. Voices muffled. 3 men, maybe 50 yards, out in the pines, talking quietly. They thought the snow covered them. The snow covered her, too. She circled wide. She had walked this ground 1,000 times in the dark, in the day, in every kind of weather. She knew every rock, every root, every place where a man could stand and be seen, and every place where a man could stand and disappear. She went to the ridge behind the cabin, climbed it in silence, settled behind a large boulder. Sharps the rock adjusted her sight, sighted through the falling snow at where she knew the tree line ought to be. Waited, because the ghost did not shoot first if she could help it. The ghost waited for a man to move, and in the waiting, she thought about Ruby. She thought about a 7-year-old girl in a widow's kitchen down in Silver Ridge, asleep in a small bed, with a picture book under her arm and a plate of cookies on the nightstand. She thought about the way Ruby smelled after a bath, warm bread and pine soap. She thought about the way Ruby laughed at her own jokes before she finished telling them. She thought about the way Ruby held her hand crossing a stream. She thought about all of it, and she let it sit in her chest, because that was where the shot came from. Not the eye, not the finger, the chest. The chest was where the reason lived, and Ellen Kincaid needed a reason to be steady tonight. Movement down and left. She let her breathing slow. She let her heart settle the streets. A man stepped out from behind a fir tree, big, broad, carrying a Winchester repeater across his chest. He looked at the cabin. He looked over his shoulder. He signaled someone behind him. Another man moved, a third, 3 men on the west side. She could not see the east or the north, but she trusted her count 8, maybe 10. Silas Drummond had brought his whole payroll. The big man carried a lantern not lit, slung across his belt with a wire loop, a signal lantern. When Silas gave the go, they would light it, and the light would tell the rest of the men to converge, break the lantern, break the signal. Nell adjusted her sight. 2 clicks left, 200 yards, snow, cold air, heavy round. She let the breath out halfway, squeezed. The sharps roared, not loud like a rifle roars, loud like the mountain roars. The big man's lantern shattered on his belt. Kerosene splashed, glass flew. The man yelped and jumped back like he had been struck by lightning and slapped at his coat and ran for cover. The other 2 men flattened. 10 yards, 10 yards left, new position behind a wedge of rock, sharps up, sighted, waited. Down and tress. She recognized the tone even if she couldn't make out the words. Silas was giving new orders. Silas was adjusting. She waited. Another man broke cover, running low, trying to circle. He was going for the corral. Nell adjusted. 2 clicks right. She did not shoot him. She shot the fence post 6 inches from his ear. Splinters exploded off the post. The man dropped flat and slid 10 feet on his belly and did not get up. She moved again, down the ridge now 20 yards. Behind a stand of pine, sharps up, sighted. Because this was the rhythm. This was the old rhythm. Move, shoot, move, never let them find you. Never give them a second look at the same place. Break the signal, break the confidence, break the plan, and do it without killing them if you could. Because dead men in the snow were dead men in the snow, but live men who thought they were being hunted by a ghost. Those men told their friends. Those men saved you a lot of digging in the spring. She waited. She listened. A branch cracked somewhere south of her, wrong direction. She turned too slow because she had been focused on the tree line, and she had not been focused on the ridge behind her. And Silas Drummond was very good, and Drummond had climbed around her while she was watching the men in the pines, and Silas Drummond was 15 feet with a pistol in his hand. He said, "Kincaid." He said, "Drop the rifle." She said, "I will shoot you," she said. "You will try." They looked at each other in the falling snow. The snow was on his shoulders, on his hat, on the barrel of his pistol. He was younger than she had expected, 40 maybe. Hard face, blue eyes, the kind of blue eyes that were nothing empty. She had seen those eyes before. In New Mexico, in Kansas, in every place where a man had learned to kill and had liked the learning. She said, "You served." He said, "I served." "Where?" "You don't want to know." "Try me," he almost. Cavalry, 6 years, then you know. Know what that meant? Doesn't hold of a woman at 15 feet with a pistol when she has a rifle in her hands. His eyes flickered. He said, "You're not going to raise it in time," she said. "You're right." Because he was right, because at 15 feet, a pistol shot was a heartbeat. And a sharps rifle needed to be levered and raised and aimed and squeezed, and even a shot as fast as Ellen Kincaid could take. It was going to be 2 heartbeats, which was 1 heartbeat too many, which meant she was not going to raise the rifle, which meant she was going to do something else. She had been holding the sharps low across her body, her right hand on the grip, her left hand under the forestock, her body angled slightly away from him. Every muscle relaxed. She had been talking to him from a position she had set up 10 seconds ago when the branch cracked. She had known even before she turned that whoever was coming was already close. She had not turned to fight. She had turned to place herself, because underneath her left forearm, tucked into the loop she'd sewn onto her sleeve was a small knife of blade, balanced for throwing. She could put it in a coffee tin at 20 feet, at 15 feet in the snow. With a man expecting the rifle, she could put it in his throat. She said, Drummond. He said, Kincaid. She said, you are going to shoot me, or you are going to walk away. Which one? He said. I am going to shoot you, she said. I am sorry to hear that. Her left hand moved. The knife came out of the sleeve loop like a fish comes out of water. She threw underhand. Because underhand was faster from that position. Because the geometry of a man's shoulder made underhand quicker than overhand when the target was chest high and the thrower was hip low. The knife caught him just below the collarbone, not the throat. Because she had aimed for the shoulder. Because Ellen Kincaid had promised herself 20 years ago that she would only kill when she had to. Because she still remembered a 16-year-old boy in an alley in Santa Fe. The knife went into Silas Drummond's shoulder up to the hilt. He gasped. His pistol arm dropped. He tried to raise it again with his other hand. She was already moving. The sharp came up in a smooth arc she had done 10,000 times in her sleep. The muzzle rose to his chest. She said one word, down. He dropped the pistol. He sat in the snow hard. He held his shoulder. Blood pushed through his fingers and steamed in the cold. He looked at her. He said, Kincaid. She said, Drummond. He said, you are a horror. She said, I have been called worse. She kicked the pistol into the pines. She said, call your men off. He said, I can't. She said, you will. He said, they don't answer to me anymore. She said, what do you mean? He said, veins here. She stopped. She looked at him. She said, say that again. He said, vein. Rode up with us, sitting in the trees on the north side. He wanted to see it himself. That's how much he hates you, she said. That's a mistake, he said. I told him, she said. Then he's mine. Silas Drummond looked at her in his hard blue eyes. Something moved that she had not seen there a minute ago. Something like relief. Something like a man who had been holding a weight for 20 years and had finally been given permission to set it down. He said, Kincaid. She said, Drummond? He said, there's a boy up on the East Ridge, 19 years old, first job, not one of ours. Contract man out of Denver. He is scared. He is not going to shoot straight. She said, why are you telling me this? He said, because I served with a man named Kincaid 10 years ago. He said his sister was a marshal. He said she was fair. She said, was your friend's name Curtis Kincaid? Changed. She said, he was my brother. His mouth opened. Nothing came out, she said. He died at Fort Riley, Cholera. 8 years ago, he said, I didn't know. She said, he talked about you. He said Silas Drummond was the best sergeant he ever had. She saw the tears come to his eyes. She saw him try to blink them back. She said, the East Ridge, the boy. He said, left of the split pine. Behind the flat stone, she said, thank you. He nodded. He put his forehead down on his knees. She said, Drummond? He said, yes. She said, sit here, do not move. When this is done, I will come back. You will testify. He said, yes. The boy in the snow. She left him in the snow with his hand pressed to his shoulder and his knife still in the meat, and she went east. The East Ridge was 300 yards. She moved the way. 3 ravens had taught her not fast. Steady. One quiet step at a time. Every step placed. Every breath measured. The snow was thicker now, coming down harder. Good. She found the split pine at the base of the ridge. She found the flat stone. She found the boy behind it. He was as scared as Silas had said. 19 years old. Cheap coat, cheap boots. A borrowed rifle across his lap. His fingers were shaking. He was crying. He was trying not to be crying. She came up behind him, set her sharps down, slipped her Colt out of the holster, put the barrel against the back of his neck. He froze. Said, son. He said, please. She said, how old are you? He said, 19. She said, where's your mother? He said, ma'am. She said, answer me, son. Where's your mother? He said, Nebraska. She said, how much did they pay you? He said, $50, ma'am. She said, 50 for what? He said, just for coming. He said, they said I wouldn't have to shoot. They said the ex-marshal would handle everything. She said, the ex-marshal is bleeding in the snow, 200 za. He whimpered. She said, son, he said. Please, ma'am. Please don't, she said. I'm not going to. He said, ma'am. She said, I want you to stand up. Slow. Drop the rifle. Walk south. Straight south. It's 2 miles. You will hit a road. Follow it east. It will take you to a stagecoach stop. You have $5 in your pocket. Buy a ticket to Cheyenne, then a ticket to Nebraska. Go home. You never came here. You never saw me. If you tell anybody what happened here, you will die. Do you understand? He said, yes, ma'am. She said, repeat it. He said, I never came here. I never saw you. I go home to my mother. She said, good boy. She lifted the colt off the back of his neck. He stood up, slow shaking. He dropped. He walked south. He never looked back. She watched him go until he disappeared into the snow. She did not know if he would go home. She did not know if he would tell someone what he had seen. But she knew this. A 19-year-old boy sent to kill a woman on a mountain deserved a second chance the way a 16-year-old boy in an alley in Santa Fe had not gotten one. The past could not be paid, but sometimes it could be honored. She picked up her sharps. She moved north. Because Silas had said Vane was on the north side. Because Vane had come to see it himself. Because Vane was going to be surrounded by his best men. Because Vane was going to be the last thing standing between Ellen Kincaid and dawn. She went slow. She let the snow work. Every 50 yards she stopped and listened. She heard gunfire behind her. Down at the cabin, a single crack from a rifle. Then a pause, then 2 more. She knew that pause. That was Adeline. Adeline was firing carefully, not wildly. She was choosing her shots. Good. Well, then a heavier shot. That was Daniel Colt. Once, someone had come through the door. Someone had come through the door, and Daniel had put them down, and Adeline was covering the back, and the cabin was holding, and Ellen Kincaid needed to end this quickly. She moved faster, book deeper in expensive boots. She reached the north side. There, 2 men behind a fallen tree, rifles up, watching the cabin, waiting for a signal. Behind them, 10 yards further back, in a small hollow of rock, a third figure, sitting on a folding camp stool with a fine coat, a silk scarf, a pair of field glasses in his hand, Cyrus Vane, watching like it was a horse race. She felt something rise in her chest that was old and cold and had a taste like iron. She did not shoot him. Not yet. She circled. She came in from the east, behind him. The 2 riflemen were facing the cabin. Vane was facing the cabin. The wind was toward her. The snow was falling between them. She had maybe 40 feet to cover across open ground. She covered it, 1 quiet step at a time. She was 10 feet behind Cyrus Vane when he sensed her, some part of him, some animal instinct that had kept a wolf like him alive for 50 years. He turned his head. His mouth opened. She said, don't. His 2 riflemen turned. She said, guns down or I shoot him. The rifleman looked at Vane. Vane's eyes were on hers. He said, do as she says. They set their rifles down in the snow. Vane said, Mrs. Cade. Nell said, Mr. Vane. He said, this is unfortunate. She said, for you. He said, the snow is heavy. Perhaps we should discuss things inside. She said, you are not coming inside my house. He almost smiled. He said, then here. She said, here. He said, you have made a serious mistake tonight. There are men in Denver who will make sure you never live to see the trial you clearly intend to bring. She said, there are federal marshals in Denver right now taking apart your ranch, Mr. Vane. There is a satchel of your bookkeeping heading to a courtroom under armed guard. There is a priest with a signed confession. There is a federal deputy who has been undercover in this town for 7 years. There is a naturalist whose sketches will be published in every newspaper east of the Mississippi. There is a state senator whose name is going to be spoken in an indictment before the week is out. He said nothing. She said, you lost, Mr. Vane. You lost hours ago. You just came up here tonight because you didn't want to admit it yet. He said, you have no idea who you are talking to. She said, I know exactly who I can tell you. I am talking to the man who held my husband in a cellar for years. His wit flickered. He said, ah. She said, yes. He said, so he did come home to you. She said, he did. He said, that is a shame. She said, for you. He looked at her. He said, Mrs. Cade. She said, yes. He said, kill me now, please. Kill me now, because if I go to Denver alive, I will spend the rest of my life in a cage, and I do not do well in cages. Do me this courtesy between hunters. She said, you are not a hunter. He said, no. She said, you are a bookkeeper with expensive boots. He said, that is a cruel thing to say. She said, it's the kindest thing anybody has ever said about you. He said, then kill me. She said, no. She stepped closer. She took a set of iron cuffs from her belt, where she hung them under her coat. She said, "You are going to walk with me down to Silver Ridge. You are going to sit in a cell. You are going to answer for every man and every animal you have destroyed. You are going to look my husband in the eye every day of a very long trial. And you are going to die old in a federal prison with nobody at your grave." He said, "Please." She said, "No." She cuffed him. His hands came behind him without a fight, because he understood. Because a man like Vane understood the shape of a lost hand the two riflemen were watching. Nell looked at them. She said, "You, both of you, put your hands on your head, walk toward the cabin, slow. If either of you runs, the sharps in my hand puts a hole through both of you. Do you understand?" They walked. She followed them through the snow. Cyrus Vane walked in front of her, with his hands cuffed behind his back and his silk scarf gone gray with snow and his field glasses hanging from his neck like a joke. They came out of the trees. The cabin was lit up. Adeline stood in the doorway with a Winchester across her chest. She saw Nell. She saw the two men with their hands on their heads. She saw Cyrus Vane in the cuffs. She said, "Oh, Nell." She started to laugh. She laughed like a woman who had been holding a screamin' for 3 hours. Nell said, "Are you all right?" Adeline said, "I'm fine." "I'm fine," Nell said. "Daniel," Adeline said, sitting up. "He shot one man through the door." "Good shot. The man is dead." The others fell back after the third shot. They must have been the two north side men joining the west side. They were coming to signal. Nell said, "Where's the body?" "The body," Adeline said, "just inside the door. We pulled him in, didn't want the others to see the boots and know we were shooting." Nell nodded. She said, "You did good." Adeline said, "So did you." Said, "Silas Drummond is on the West Ridge with a knife in his shoulder. Not going anywhere. There's a young man walking south to a stage stop. There's 5 men out here, 2 dead maybe, 3 running." Adeline said, "Nell." Nell said, "What?" Adeline said, "Look." She pointed down the trail. Lanterns, 6 of them, moving up through the snow, coming fast. Nell raised the sharps. Then she lowered it, because she saw the lead rider, because she knew that bearing, because that was Owen Blackwood. He had ridden through the night from wherever he had been. He had ridden without stopping. He had brought 5 deputies with him. He was here. He came up the trail and reined in 10 yards from the cabin. He looked at the woman standing in the snow, a rifle in her hand and Cyrus Eats cuffs at her feet. He said, Kincaid," said Blackwood. "M-I-E," he said. "You're on time." He laughed. He swung down off his horse. He walked over. He looked at Vane. He looked at the 2 men with their hands on their heads. He looked at Adeline in the doorway with the Winchester. He looked at Nell. He said, "Kincaid." She said, "Yes." He said, "You look tired." She said, "I am tired." He said, "Sit down. We'll take it from here." She sat down right there in the snow. She had not realized how tired she was until he told her to sit, and her legs gave out, and she was on the ground with the sharps across her lap and her breath making clouds in the lantern light. While Blackwood knelt beside her, he said, Kincaid." She said, "Yes." He said, "You did it." She said, "Not yet." He said, "Almost." She said, "Ruby." He said, 2 of the deputies rode past Mrs. Hensley's house on the way up. "Your daughter is asleep. 2 men on the porch. Her word is Grace." She said, "How did you?" He said, "You told Wheeler. Wheeler wired me. I made sure." She closed her eyes. She said, "Thank you." He said, "You are welcome." She said, "Daniel." He said, "Let's go see him." He helped her up. She walked into the cabin. Daniel was sitting up on the bed, Colt in his lap, Judge the bear beside him on the blanket. He looked pale as bone, but his eyes were bright and his back was straight, and there was a body in the entryway that Adeline had covered with a horse blanket. He looked at Nell. She looked at him. She said, "It's done." He said, "Vane?" She cupped outside. "Blackwood has him." He said, "Nell." She said, "Daniel." He said, "You came back." She said, "I promised." He held out his hand. She went to him. She sat on the edge of the bed. She took his hand. His fingers were warm, now warm from the fire, from the food Adeline had put in him, from being inside a house for the first time in years. She says, she said, she sensed Judge with me. She said Mame needed him more. Daniel made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob. He picked up the bear. He held Judge against his chest. He said, "Our daughter." She said, "Our daughter." They sat there for a long time. Outside, the marshals were doing the work of marshals. The men were being loaded. The bodies were being wrapped. The horses were being gathered. Owen Blackwood was directing everything with the calm of a man who had done this 100 times. The snow kept falling, slowly, gently, like the mountain was closing a book. The new cabin, 3 weeks later. The snow was 3 feet deep in the valleys and 5 in the passes, and the mountain had gone silent the way it always did in true winter. Nell stood on the porch of the new cabin when she, Daniel Wheeler, and 2 of Blackwood's deputies had raised in 12 days on the south slope, where the sun came earlier and stayed longer. It was smaller than the old cabin. 2 rooms, a tight loft, a stone hearth that Daniel had built with his own hands, with Wheeler passing him stones one at a time. They had burned the old cabin. Nell had asked for it. Blackwood had understood. The old cabin had been where the men had come. The old cabin had been where the door had opened, and a man had fallen dead in the entry. The old cabin had been where she had watched Daniels sleep with Judge the Bear on his chest, not knowing if the night would end with her a widow or with her a wife again. She could not raise Ruby in that cabin, so they had burned it. The new cabin faced south. She stood on its porch now. She wore Daniel's old coat because her own was still soaked from digging snow but offshoots of stew off the roof. She held a tin cup of coffee. The steam rose past her chin. Behind her, through the log wall, she could hear laughter. Ruby was in there, with Daniel. The child had been back for 8 days. The reunion had been slow. Not what people expected. Not the running into arms. Not the tears. Not the movies of the mind reunion. Ruby was 7. Ruby had been told for 5 years that her father was gone. Ruby had built a small, careful, boy-sized picture of a man in her mind who lived somewhere she could not reach. And then a tall, thin man with a beard had come into Mrs. Hensley's kitchen and had knelt down in front of her, and he had held out his hand, and he had said, "I made you a bird once." And Ruby had looked at him. Ruby had looked at him a long time. She had said yes. He had said, "Do you remember me?" She had said, "You smell like the coat in the box." He had cried. Right there, right on Mrs. Hensley's kitchen floor, and Ruby had watched a grown man cry for the first time in her life, and she had reached out, slow, careful, and put her small hand on his cheek, and she had said, "Are you my father?" And Daniel had said yes, and Ruby had thought about it. She had said, "Then you should come home with us." That had been 8 days ago. Since then, Ruby had spent every minute deciding what she thought about this new person. She had watched him. She had asked him questions. She had asked him if he could carve her another bird, because she had left the first one at the old cabin and it had burned. He had said yes. He had carved her a hawk. He had carved her a rabbit. He had carved her a small horse that looked exactly like Rebel, down to the little chip in his left ear. Ruby had accepted each one with the seriousness of a queen, accepting tribute, and on the 4th night she had climbed up into Daniel's lap after supper, and she had said, "Father," and Daniel had said yes, and she had said, "You should not have stayed away so long," and Daniel had said, "I know," and she had said, "But now you are home," and Daniel had said yes, and she had said, "It's all right," and she had fallen asleep against his chest, and Daniel sat there and sat holding his daughter for 2 hours without moving because he was afraid if he moved, the world would change again. Nell had watched from the doorway. Nell had not cried, because there was still work to do, and Ellen Kincaid did not cry until the work was done. Now, 3 weeks after the night on the mountain, the work was almost done. Cyrus Vane was in a federal cell in Denver awaiting trial. The state senator he had bought had resigned 2 days. After the newspapers ran Adeline's sketches, Wesley Doyle had pled guilty in exchange for 8 years and full testimony. Wheeler was on leave awaiting his review. Father Elias was already scheduled to testify. Silas Drummond was in a hospital in Denver. He had refused a lawyer. He had said only Kincaid called. He was going to testify against Vane, because a soldier remembered a soldier, because Curtis Kincaid had been a good man, and his sister was a good woman, and Silas Drummond had spent 20 years working for a bookkeeper in expensive boots, and he was tired of it a bit. Blackwood had said the case would take a year to move through the courts. Nell had said fine. She had time. She had the rest of her life. She sipped her coffee. The door opened behind her. Daniel came out. He walked slow. He walked with a limp. He would walk with a limp for the rest of his life. Years as Elser had left him with a bad hip and a chest that took longer to fill than it should, but He was here. He was here, on the porch of a new cabin on a mountain that was theirs. He was standing beside her, with his hand on the small of her back. He said, Nell. She said, Daniel. He said, she's asleep. She said, good. He said, she asked me to tell you now you were a good judge. Judge said, Judge is a real good sheriff. He said, the best. They stood there. The snow was silent. The stars were out. He said, Nell. She said, yes. He said, I never thanked you. She said, you don't have to. He said, I do. She looked at him. He said, I know what it cost you. I know what you had to become. I know what you'd promised yourself. I know. She said, Daniel. He said, she said, I would do it again tomorrow. He said, I know. She said, that is what love is. He said, I know. He put his forehead against hers. They stood there in the cold with the light of the fire coming through the window behind them and the mountain in front of them and everything they had ever wanted quiet in the loft between them. He said, the suds, the ghost. She said, yes. He said, is she gone now? She said, she is sleeping. He said, for good. She said, I hope so. He said, but if she has to wake up again. She said, she will. He said, for our girl. She said, for our girl. He said, for this mountain. For this mountain. They stood there a long time. Then he said, Nell. She said, yes. He said, come inside. She said, in a minute. He said, all right. He kissed her hair. He went back inside. She stayed on the porch. She watched the snow. She thought about the letter, the false letter. The one Vane's forger had written in Daniel's hand. She had burned it 2 nights ago in the new hearth. She had not told Daniel. She had held it up in front of the fire and she had looked at it one last time. She had read the words, I cannot stay. I love you, but I cannot stay. Forgive me if you can. And she had dropped it in the flames, and it had curled and blackened and gone. 5 years of grief, gone. Not because she had forgiven the man who wrote it, but because she had held the man who hadn't. Mid-June spring came slow that year. The high country always let go last. By April, the valleys were green, and by May, there were calves in the far pastures, and by June the elk had come down out of the peaks with their new calves at their sides. And the water in the streams was cold and clear, and the willows had leafed out and the mountain was itself again. The Nell Cade Wildlife Sanctuary was formally established the first day of June. 2,000 acres, protected forever, no hunting, no logging, no mining, no development. A small research station on South Slope run by Dr. Adeline Whitfield of Cornell University, who had taken her sabbatical in the Rocky Mountains and had never gone back. The dedication ceremony was small, just family. Owen Blackwood came up from Denver. Wheeler came with him. Father Elias drove out from Silver Ridge with a picnic basket. Mrs. Hensley brought pies. Adeline had strung small white flags along the trail up to the meadow where they put the marker stone. The stone was simple. Just names, William Hollister, Nell Cade, Ellen Kincaid, and underneath. For those who kept faith, Ruby stood between her parents. She was almost 8 now. She wore a blue dress her mother had made her. Her hair was in 2 long braids. She held a small bunch of purple columbine that she had picked herself an hour before. She looked at the stone. She read the words. Slow, careful. She had learned to read when it was. She said, Mama. Nell said, yes, Ree said. Why is your name not just Cade? Nell said, because a long time ago before I met your father, I was somebody named Kincaid. And that woman did some things she was proud of and some things she was not, and she needs to be remembered too, Riku. Ruby thought about this. She stepped. All right, so Ruby laid the combine at the base of the stone. She stepped back. She took her father's hand on one side, her mother's hand on the other. She said, was she a good woman? Nell said, I hope so. Ruby said, I think she was. Daniel said, so do I. Ruby nodded. She said, so do. The 3 of them stood there. The mountain was green around them. A hawk turned in the sky. A single elk stepped out of the tree line half a mile off and looked at them and did not run and then walked away. Daniel looked at his wife. He said, so, Daniel? He said, come on. She said, where? He said, home. She said, all right. The 3 of them turned. They walked down the trail toward the cabin. The stone stood in the meadow with the purple flowers at its base. The wind moved through the grass. The sun caught the letters and held them for a moment and then let them go. And Sunfart, a stream ran clear and cold across pale stones, and a mountain lion drank at dawn, and a bear turned over a rotten log and found grubs, and a small herd of elk grazed in a meadow that, had once been a killing ground and would never be one again. Some mountains hide secrets. Some mountains keep promises. This one did both. The ghost was sleeping, the mother was home, and the family walked down the trail together in the sunlight. Now the wind carried the sound of a 7-year-old girl laughing at something her father had said, and the sound rose up out of the pines and up over the meadow and up over the peaks and into the wide, clean sky. And the mountain heard it, and the mountain was glad.